We like to believe history is a long march of progress, that every new president is a step forward, a course correction, a fresh page in the sacred book of freedom. But sometimes history gets drunk, loses the script, and hands the nuclear codes to a man who can't spell nuclear. This is not a story about political parties or policy debates or how your grandfather used to vote. This is a story about failure, legendary, combustible, country-wrecking failure. A story of men who stood at the wheel of the American ship and steered it directly into the iceberg. Welcome to The Worst U.S. Presidents, a bedtime tale about the moments when democracy tripped over its own shoelaces and face-planted into the mud. Our journey begins on the eve of civil war, with a man who looked at the flames licking at the foundation of the country and said, "Not my problem." James Buchanan. There's a particular flavor of failure that doesn't come from doing the wrong thing. It comes from doing absolutely nothing, while everything around you disintegrates into blood, smoke, and ash. Enter James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, the last one before the Civil War, and the kind of man who looked at a rapidly fracturing republic and said, in essence, "I believe this is none of my business." Let's set the stage. The year is 1857. America is a simmering stew of contradictions. The North is industrializing. The South is doubling down on slavery. The middle, cracking under the weight of compromise. Violence is already erupting in Kansas. Congress is a battlefield of canes and insults, and enslaved human beings are being traded like livestock in the Capitol itself. The country needs a leader. Instead, it gets James Buchanan, a colorless, commitment-averse Pennsylvanian whose defining political skill was avoiding hard decisions for as long as humanly possible. He enters office at 65, unmarried, stiff, ceremonial, and deeply convinced that the Constitution should never be disturbed by the petty demands of human decency. A man described by one contemporary as having the backbone of a chocolate eclair. It gets worse. Just 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration, the Supreme Court releases its most infamous ruling, Dred Scott vs. Sanford. In it, the court declares that Black Americans are not, and never can be, citizens, that Congress has no right to prohibit slavery in any U.S. territory, and that basically the entire Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional all along. It's the legal equivalent of lighting the fuse on a national time bomb. And Buchanan? He knew it was coming. In fact, he helped nudge it into existence. He'd privately pressured a Northern justice to vote with the Southern majority, which, in case you're wondering, is not how separation of powers is supposed to work. Then in his inaugural address, he has the gall to cite the court's impending decision as proof that the slavery issue is about to be resolved, peacefully, judicially, permanently. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The aftermath was chaos. Northern abolitionists were enraged. Southern fire eaters felt emboldened. Moderates fled to the far ends of the spectrum. The political center collapsed. And Buchanan? He hosted dinner parties. He wrote long-winded vetoes. He sighed about how tragic all this unpleasantness was, as if he were a tourist in a collapsing building, annoyed at the dust. To be clear, the South wasn't just unhappy. They were preparing to secede. And Buchanan, faced with the greatest constitutional crisis in American history to date, decided to go full Hamlet. Yes, secession is illegal, but doing anything about it is also illegal. Oh dear, this is not a joke. Buchanan sincerely believed that the federal government had no constitutional authority to stop a state from leaving the Union. That's like saying you're the captain of a ship, but you're not allowed to touch the wheel while it's sinking. As South Carolina and 6 other states peeled off from the Union, forming a breakaway confederacy, Buchanan released a message to Congress where he condemned secession, but also condemned military action. He saw himself as a guardian of peace. In practice, he was the enabler of a bloodbath. His cabinet began to disintegrate. Southern loyalists resigned. His Secretary of War started shipping weapons to Confederate arsenals before the war even began. And Buchanan? He just sat there, doing nothing, always nothing. Because in Buchanan's world, leadership meant being above the fray, soaring high above the trenches like a Victorian ghost, unmoved, untouched, utterly useless. And then there was the panic of 1857. The stock market crashed, banks failed, unemployment soared, the North suffered disproportionately. Buchanan, ever the economic minimalist, believed the government had no responsibility to intervene. To him, poverty was a natural consequence of capitalism's divine order. The invisible hand was always right, even when it was strangling people. But let's not paint him as just weak or naive. Buchanan wasn't a fool. He was deeply intelligent, skilled in law, seasoned in diplomacy. He'd been Secretary of State, a senator, minister to the UK. No, Buchanan's flaw wasn't ignorance. It was cowardice in the face of moral reckoning. He saw the monster, he knew its name. And instead of fighting it, he handed it a chair and asked if it needed anything to drink. In his final months, Buchanan would write bitter letters to newspapers, defending his legacy, insisting the war was Lincoln's fault, and warning that history would vindicate him. Spoiler, it didn't. Historians have, almost unanimously, ranked Buchanan at the bottom of presidential rankings for over a century. Even Nixon sometimes comes out ahead of him. But here's the part that stings. Buchanan wasn't some grotesque caricature of villainy. He wasn't a demagogue, or a warmonger, or a tyrant. He was something much more dangerous. He was a moderate in a time that called for conviction, a peacemaker in a moment that demanded justice, a placeholder in history's most pivotal moment, and for that he paid the ultimate price, not in his own blood, but in the blood of 600,000 others who had to clean up his mess. But, and here's your crumb of redemption, Buchanan did one noble thing. He left. He recognized, at the very least, that he was not the man for the moment. He didn't run for re-election. He didn't try to cling to power. He faded into the shadows, where perhaps he belonged, and maybe in a world of careerist politicians and egomaniacs, that counts for something. Still, as the cannonballs of Fort Sumter began to fly, Buchanan was already sipping tea at his estate in Wheatland, watching the world burn in his rearview mirror. And yet nothing was just the beginning, because what happens when the next guy does something, but all the wrong somethings? What happens when Reconstruction begins and a Southern sympathizer takes the wheel? Andrew Johnson, the Reconstruction saboteur. If James Buchanan was the man who let America fall apart, Andrew Johnson was the man who tried to glue it back together with spit, bourbon, and racial resentment. This is the story of a tailor from Tennessee who rose from poverty to the presidency and then used that power to stop a nation from becoming better than it had been. Let's rewind the tape. It's April 1865. The Civil War is over. The Confederacy is dead. Lincoln is victorious. The Union has been saved, at the cost of 750,000 lives and a shattered national psyche. America is standing at a moral crossroads, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rebuild not just brick and mortar, but justice itself, to create a multiracial democracy, to right the foundational sin of slavery, to forge a new social contract. But then, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and into the void steps his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, a staunch Unionist, yes, but also a lifelong racist, a man who hated the Southern elite and also hated the idea of black equality. So when Johnson takes the oath of office, there's a brief flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this stubborn son of a gun will carry Lincoln's torch. That hope dies fast. From the beginning, Johnson treats Reconstruction not as a second founding, but as a minor home repair. In his eyes, the South had never truly left the Union, just gotten a little rowdy. And now that the war's over, they just need a slap on the wrist and a warm welcome home. So he sets about pardoning thousands of ex-Confederates, wealthy planners, generals, politicians, you name it, returning their lands and their rights like nothing ever happened. Meanwhile, newly freed Black Americans are starving, homeless, hunted. They want land, they want protection, they want justice. Johnson gives them lectures. He vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, designed to provide food, shelter, and education to formerly enslaved people. He vetoes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, meant to guarantee basic legal protections. He vetoes the 14th Amendment, intended to grant citizenship and equal protection under the law. It becomes a pattern. If a bill helps former slaves or restrains former slaveholders, Johnson kills it. He becomes the human veto stamp of racial progress. And Congress? Congress is losing its mind. This is the radical Republican era, a time when Northern lawmakers were hell-bent on remaking the South enforcing civil rights and punishing traitors. But every time they push forward, Johnson slams on the brakes. Not with subtlety either. Johnson was not a quiet obstructionist. He was loud. He was inflammatory. He went on national speaking tours denouncing Congress, the press, and black activists in vitriolic rants. One speech compared himself to Jesus and his critics to Judas. Another accused Republicans of plotting his assassination. This wasn't governance. It was a political bar fight, fueled by resentment, booze, and a barely concealed white supremacist worldview. But here's where it gets historically grotesque. Johnson believed he was defending the Constitution. He saw himself as the last line of defense against mob rule. In his own mind, he was the noble outsider standing up to radicalism. And yet, his idea of the Constitution didn't include black people. Not really. He argued, sincerely, that giving them civil rights would lead to a tyranny of the unqualified, that allowing them to vote would degrade white society, that freedom should be earned, not given, even by people who had endured centuries of unpaid labor and systematic torture. When Congress overrode his vetoes, and they did repeatedly, Johnson got angrier, more isolated, more combative. He began firing officials who didn't support him, violating the newly passed Tenure of Office Act. And that's when Congress had enough. In 1868, Andrew Johnson became the first U.S. president to be impeached. The official charge was his removal of Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. But the real reason? He was standing in the way of national redemption. He was holding back history's tide with both hands, screaming into the wind. The Senate missed convicting him by one vote. He stayed in office, but he was finished. His presidency limped to its end, disgraced and embittered. He didn't run for re-election. He didn't write a grand memoir. He returned to Tennessee, where he complained about how misunderstood he was, like a bad ex blaming the breakup on society. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Johnson was not a villain in the classic sense. He didn't embezzle. He didn't wage pointless wars. He didn't destroy the economy. In fact, if you only measured fiscal prudence, he was fairly responsible. But he failed on a deeper level. When the nation needed moral imagination, he offered legalism. When it needed courage, he gave bitterness. When it needed to move forward, he clung to a past soaked in chains. And yet, there is one small, bitterly ironic point in Johnson's favor. He stayed loyal to the Union when nearly every other Southern Democrat did not. He rejected secession. He supported Lincoln during the war. He didn't betray the country, just the people in it. And maybe in the end, that's what makes Johnson so uniquely tragic. He loved the Union, but not the future it was trying to build. He fought to save America, but not to change it. And so the country tried to rise from its ashes, while the man at the helm shoved it back into the fire. But speaking of fire, Franklin Pierce, the handsome collapse. Franklin Pierce looked like a president from Central Casting, jawline carved from granite, eyes like sorrowful ice, voice like old whiskey. But if James Buchanan was a ghost in the machine, and Andrew Johnson was a sledgehammer in a glass factory, Franklin Pierce was something subtler, something more seductive. He was the velvet glove on the iron fist of collapse. Let's rewind. It's 1853. The country is still pretending it can hold itself together. Slavery is tearing at the seams of the republic. Compromises are being stacked like sandbags against a moral flood. The war drums are distant, but beating. Enter Pierce, a smooth-talking, compromise-hugging New Hampshire Democrat, with the tragic backstory of a Shakespearean nobleman and the political backbone of a jellyfish in a suit. His nickname? Handsome Frank. His vibe? That one guy at the party who knows everyone, drinks bourbon neat, and always disappears when the cops show up. Pierce was a doughface, a northern man with southern principles. And when it came to slavery, that meant one thing. Don't touch it. Don't criticize it. Don't stop its expansion. Just smooth things over. Keep the South happy. Pretend the fire in the basement is just a warm breeze. And his masterpiece of destruction? The Kansas-Nebraska Act. If you're wondering how to turn political tension into outright carnage, this law is the blueprint. It repealed the Missouri Compromise, a delicate agreement that had kept slavery out of certain territories, and replaced it with something called popular sovereignty. Translation: let the settlers decide. Let the people vote on whether slavery should be legal in new territories like Kansas and Nebraska. Democracy. How charming. How fair. Except, of course, this was a democracy soaked in violence, bribery, and blood. Pro-slavery forces from Missouri flooded into Kansas, armed and furious. Abolitionists rushed in from the north. Ballot boxes were stuffed. Homes were burned. People were murdered. They called it Bleeding Kansas. And Franklin Pierce? He didn't just sign the act. He enforced it with federal troops against anti-slavery settlers. Yes, you heard that right. The President of the United States in the mid-1850s sent federal firepower not to stop slavery, but to protect it. Because to Pierce, the real danger wasn't human bondage. It was disunity. It was confrontation. It was upsetting the very people whose entire economy was built on the backs of stolen lives. He wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in harmony, the kind that keeps the violin section playing while the orchestra pit is on fire. And speaking of harmony, let's talk about his cabinet. Pierce's administration was stacked with Southern sympathizers and expansionists, men who dreamed of a growing American empire fueled by slave labor. Under Pierce, the U.S. made moves to annex Cuba, then a Spanish colony with a booming slave economy. The plan failed, but the intent was clear: expand the South, enshrine slavery forever, export it even. This wasn't compromise anymore. This was policy, doctrine, expansionist slavery diplomacy in a tuxedo. All of this from a man who started his presidency with one of the most horrific personal tragedies imaginable. Shortly before taking office, Pierce and his wife were riding a train with their young son Benny when it derailed. Benny was thrown from the car, killed instantly. The Pierces watched it happen. They arrived in Washington in mourning clothes. Jane Pierce, Franklin's wife, believed the accident was divine punishment for accepting the presidency. She might have been right, because Pierce's leadership was haunted, not just by grief, but by paralysis. His attempts at national unity collapsed under the weight of reality. His faith in popular will became a suicide pact for the Republic. Even his own party turned on him. When it came time for re-election, the Democrats politely told him to sit this one out. Franklin Pierce became the first elected president to fail to win his own party's nomination for a second term. Ouch. He left office isolated, disgraced, and deeply alcoholic. In fact, he'd been drinking heavily throughout his presidency, and after leaving Washington, he went full tilt. His decline, both personal and political. When the Civil War finally broke out, Pierce, true to form, opposed Lincoln. Not because he supported the Confederacy, of course, but because he thought the war was Lincoln's fault for being too aggressive. Yes, really. Imagine watching a country tear itself apart over a centuries-old sin and blaming the guy who finally tried to stop it. And yet, even in the wreckage, Pierce wasn't without complexity. He had once opposed the Mexican-American War on moral grounds. He believed imperialism was a sin. He believed in states' rights, yes, but not in conquest. And in his private writings, there's an anguish, a torment. He wasn't blind. He saw what was happening. He just didn't believe in confronting it. Pierce was the great enabler, the silencer, the well-meaning man who makes monsters possible by never telling them no. And maybe, just maybe, that's the scariest kind of president there is. Not the tyrant, not the fool, but the gentleman in the middle, smiling, shaking hands, and signing death warrants in cursive. But if we have to find something redeeming, Pierce truly believed in union, not the just kind, not the righteous kind, but the enduring kind, the stubborn, blood-stained, ironclad union that somehow survived the likes of him. But if Franklin Pierce was the nice guy who turned on the gas and walked away, the next man barely got time to strike a match. Because sometimes the worst thing a president can do is die. William Henry Harrison. The cold open of presidential tragedy. Some presidents destroy economies, some dismantle civil rights, some start wars they can't finish, and some just die. But not quietly, not gracefully, not in a way that evokes statesman-like dignity. William Henry Harrison died like the setup to a cosmic joke. A punchline written by fate, weather, and pride. He was the 9th president of the United States, and he lasted exactly 31 days. Let's set the stage. It's 1841. The United States is still young, restless, and teetering on the brink of adolescence. The parties are shifting. The Jacksonian era has just ended. The Whigs, Yes, Whigs are trying to find their footing. So who do they pick? A war hero, a legend from the Battle of Tippecanoe, a frontier general, a walking statue of American masculinity. They pick William Henry Harrison, 68 years old, with hair like a powdered helmet and lungs that, as it turns out, were about to betray him. But here's the catch. Harrison wasn't a visionary. He wasn't a great orator. He wasn't even that politically influential, his greatest talent being the anti-Jackson. In the 1840 campaign, he was portrayed as a log cabin populist who drank hard cider and lived like the common man. Despite being born into a wealthy Virginia family, the son of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So, it was marketing, straight-up brand positioning, the political version of a hipster flannel shirt made in a luxury factory. And it worked. The slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, catchy, meaningless. Perfect. Harrison stomped into the White House with the weight of myth behind him. He'd be a man of the people, they said. He'd break the executive tyranny of Jackson, they said. He'd return power to the legislature, they said. But first, he had to deliver his inaugural address, and that's where the trouble began. March 4th, 1841. It's cold, bone-chilling, the kind of DC wind that slices through wool like a razor. But Harrison, ever the war hero, ever the performative stoic, refuses to wear a hat or gloves or coat. He's got something to prove. Then he starts talking and keeps talking and keeps talking. His inaugural address is the longest in U.S. history, over 8,400 words, nearly 2 hours long, delivered outdoors, in the cold, to a crowd that stopped listening halfway through. It is a windy, miserable, epic monologue that meanders through ancient Rome, executive restraint, and vague allusions to high ideals. By the time he wraps it up, his audience is frozen, his staff is annoyed, and his lungs have drafted their resignation letter. Within days, Harrison develops a cough, then a fever, then pneumonia, then enteritis, then a full-blown infection. The 19th century medical response? Bleeding, leeches, and opium. Classic. Doctors tried mustard plasters, castor oil, snake oil, basically everything except what might have helped. Warmth, rest, hydration, and antibiotics, which didn't exist. Harrison's health spirals. He becomes delirious. He starts hallucinating, reportedly shouting orders to his long-dead generals. And on April 4th, 1841, exactly 1 month after taking office, he dies. Just like that. The President of the United States, dead from a cold he caught at his own inauguration, killed by his own speech. You can't make this stuff up. Now, to be fair, modern historians suspect it may not have been pneumonia that killed him at all. Some believe Harrison died from enteric fever, caused by contaminated drinking water in the White House. Back then, Washington, D.C. had all the sanitary wisdom of a medieval butcher shop. The water near the executive mansion was essentially raw sewage. So, either way, his body failed him. Whether by frostbite or fecal bacteria, William Henry Harrison became a trivia footnote. The shortest presidency in U.S. history, the man who talked himself to death. But here's the uncomfortable truth. His death had consequences. Big ones. Because when Harrison died, the country was suddenly under the control of his vice president, John Tyler, a man who, spoiler alert, nobody actually wanted to be president, including his own party. Harrison hadn't even begun to govern. He never nominated a Supreme Court justice, never signed a bill into law, never formed a cabinet with any real authority. His presidency was a presidential null, a Shakespearean prologue to someone else's tragedy. And yet, let's not be too glib. For all his foolish bravado, Harrison was a man of conviction. He had real views about the limits of presidential power. He wanted to undo the executive overreach of Jackson. He believed in returning strength to Congress. He saw himself as a transitional figure, a stabilizer, a restorer, and ironically, in death, he helped define the Constitution's presidential succession process. Because when Harrison died, nobody was quite sure what was supposed to happen next. Was the vice president just an acting president, or did he fully become president? John Tyler said, "Screw it, I'm the real president now." Moved into the White House, took the oath, and set the precedent that the vice president becomes full president on a vacancy. It stuck. So in a weird, morbid twist, Harrison's death clarified a constitutional gray area. His expiration made the presidency a little more durable. His absence gave America a rule. And for that, if nothing else, he deserves a sliver of credit because the man who followed him wasn't a war hero, wasn't a consensus builder, wasn't even a real Whig. He was an accidental president, and what he did next would split his own party in half. John Tyler, the accidental president who betrayed everyone. John Tyler wasn't supposed to be president. Not even close. He was the backup plan to a backup plan, a Whig party compromise, a paperweight of a vice president meant to fill out the ticket, tip the balance, shake a few Southern hands, and politely fade into the wallpaper. Then William Henry Harrison died after 31 days in office, and the wallpaper took over the White House. And what did John Tyler do? He lit his own party on fire, vetoed every bill they passed, and rode out of Washington with a trail of political enemies and a Confederate flag fluttering behind him. Let's talk about the man who broke the Whigs and then broke the rules of post-presidential obscurity by dying on the wrong side of a civil war. The accidental ascent. It all started in 1841 when Tyler, then a 51-year-old former Democrat from Virginia, was chosen as Harrison's running mate because he looked moderate, said little, and came with a faint Southern fragrance of electoral balance. No one really expected anything of him, including himself. But when Harrison dropped dead from hubris and hypothermia, Tyler found himself facing a constitutional blank page. No one knew what the vice president was supposed to do in that situation. Did he just fill in? Did he become acting president? Did he sit in Harrison's chair until the next election while the country awkwardly waited? Tyler didn't wait to ask. He moved into the White House, declared himself the full president, took the oath, ordered people to stop calling him acting anything. And to be fair, he was right. The Constitution was vague, but Tyler's bold move set a precedent that still holds today. The vice president becomes president when the chief dies, resigns, or is removed. He called it the Tyler precedent. History calls it accurate, but that's where the story stops being admirable and starts being absurd. The Whigs versus their own president. You see, Tyler may have run with the Whigs, but he wasn't really a Whig. He had once been a Democrat, a states' rights man who hated Andrew Jackson just enough to defect. But he didn't believe in the Whig agenda of national infrastructure projects, banking reforms, or strong congressional leadership. So when the Whig-controlled Congress started sending him bills, he vetoed them, one by one. All of them. First, the bill to create a new national bank. Veto. Then the revised bank bill. Veto again. Infrastructure spending. Nope. Tariffs. Not unless they fit his philosophy of limited federal power. It was like watching someone walk into a team meeting, declare themselves CEO, and then fire everyone for having ideas. Congress was furious. His entire cabinet resigned, except Daniel Webster, who apparently stuck around out of either morbid curiosity or stubbornness. Henry Clay, the Whig puppet master, launched an open war against Tyler. Whig newspapers branded him a traitor. His mail was filled with insults. Crowds burned him in effigy. Eventually, the Whig Party did something no major party has done before or since. They expelled their own president. Let that sink in. John Tyler's the only U.S. president to be kicked out of his own political party while in office. He finished his term with no allies, no agenda, and no chance at re-election. The lonely legacy. Tyler spent the last 2 years of his presidency isolated and increasingly erratic. With Congress refusing to work with him, he tried to build his own base, founding what he called the Democratic-Republican Party. Yes, seriously. Which had fewer actual members than a moderately successful book club. He tried to annex Texas, which eventually happened under Polk, not him. He tried to appoint people to the Supreme Court, but Congress rejected 9 of his nominations. 9. For reference, in modern politics, rejecting even one nominee is a scandal. Tyler had an entire basketball team of judicial faceplants. At one point, the House of Representatives seriously considered impeaching him. Not for high crimes, but for just being John Tyler. The motion failed, but the humiliation stuck. And so, when his term ended in 1845, he slunk back to his Virginia plantation, Sherwood Forest, where he hosted lavish parties, fathered more children, he had 15 total, and watched the country drift toward the abyss of civil war. And then he made his final unforgivable move. the Confederate president, sort of. In 1861, as secession fever gripped the South, Tyler, now an elder statesman, was called upon to help mediate peace between the Union and the Confederacy. He attended the Peace Conference of 1861, where delegates desperately tried to avoid war. He gave speeches, he argued for compromise. Then, when compromise failed, he joined the Confederacy. Yep, John Tyler, 10th President of the United States, sided with the rebels. He was elected to the Confederate Congress. He denounced Lincoln. He supported Southern independence. When he died in 1862, he was the only U.S. president ever to die. A declared enemy of the United States. Washington, D.C. didn't even acknowledge his death. No flags lowered, no official mourning. His coffin was draped not in stars and stripes, but in the stars and bars of the Confederate flag. His obituary might as well have read, "Here lies a man who spent 4 years in the White House and 20 years trying to undo it." But if we have to be fair, Tyler was firm. He stuck to his beliefs. He interpreted the Constitution with a rigid, almost monastic purity. He wasn't corrupt. He wasn't vain. He didn't exploit the office for wealth or favor. He just thought the federal government should barely exist, that the states should run the show, that slavery was a states' rights issue, that rebellion was justified if Washington went too far. And in the most tragically consistent way imaginable, he died living that belief. Sometimes the worst leaders aren't the ones who betray their ideals. They're the ones who follow them too far and drag the country down with them. But what happens when the next guy takes over and instead of breaking his party, he just disappears into compromise? Millard Fillmore, the compromiser who chose the chains. Millard Fillmore is the answer to a trivia question. A presidential speed bump. A man whose name feels made up even as you say it. Millard Fillmore. It sounds like a mid-level magician or a cartoon banker who denies you a mortgage. But behind that whimsical name is a presidency built on moral surrender. A legacy carved from compromise. The kind that ruins lives and burns history books in slow motion. Let's go back. The Accidental President, Part 2. Millard Fillmore was never supposed to be president. Noticing a theme yet? He was vice president under Zachary Taylor, the blunt war hero turned president who hated slavery but didn't love politics. In July 1850, Taylor suddenly died, likely from contaminated water, heat stroke, or the 19th century being medically useless. Fillmore took the oath. And just like that, America had a new leader, a man described by one historian as the bland leading the bland. But appearances deceive, because behind the blandness was a man with an obsession: preserve the Union at all costs. And by all costs, we mean civil liberties, human rights, and the future of an entire race of people. The Compromise of 1850, a national lie. At the heart of Fillmore's presidency was a toxic legislative Frankenstein, the Compromise of 1850. It was supposed to calm tensions between North and South, to settle the issue of slavery in new territories gained after the Mexican-American War. It was billed as a grand bargain, a way to avoid secession, to delay the storm. And yes, it had some surface-level balance. California would enter as a free state. The slave trade, not slavery itself, would be banned in Washington, D.C. The South got stronger fugitive slave laws. Wait, back up. What was that last one? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. A legal abomination. It required citizens, all citizens, to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. It denied accused fugitives a jury trial. It paid federal marshals more for returning a person to slavery than for setting them free. And it gave Southern slave catchers the green light to storm into northern cities and kidnap black people, freedmen included, and drag them back into bondage. And who signed it into law? Millard Fillmore. Not reluctantly, not under duress. He championed it. He believed that peace required sacrifice, that to save the Union, morality could wait, that compromise, even with slavery, was the adult thing to do. It was compromise with handcuffs, with blood, with mothers screaming as their children were torn away in the name of national unity, a nation's soul, up for auction. The result? Horror. Northern cities became battlegrounds. Black communities were terrorized. Former slaves who had lived free for years were kidnapped in broad daylight, and white citizens were forced, by law, to become accomplices. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in response, a literary slap across the face of Fillmore's America. Abolitionists who had once hoped to work within the system turned to radicalism. The South, they saw the act as confirmation that slavery was a national institution protected by the federal government. They demanded more. All Fillmore had done was pour gasoline on the fire and hand out buckets labeled moderation, political exile, and nativist resurrection. When Fillmore left office in 1853, the Whig Party was already bleeding out from its own contradictions. Northerners hated the fugitive slave laws. Southerners hated federal restraint. The party imploded. Fillmore, having torched his own coalition, wandered the political wilderness. Then, in one of history's weirder plot twists, he returned as the presidential candidate for the Know-Nothing Party. Yes, that was its real name. Officially called the American Party, it was a deeply xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic movement, riding a wave of nativist paranoia. The Know-Nothing nickname came from its members' refusal to reveal anything about the group's activities. They'd say, "I know nothing." Fillmore, ever the political chameleon, joined their ticket in 1856, not because he was passionate about the cause, but because it was a vehicle to run again. He won one state, Maryland. Then he disappeared into the fog of failed comebacks and historical oblivion, the bureaucrat who blinked. So what kind of president was Millard Fillmore really? He wasn't corrupt. He wasn't cruel in the traditional sense. He didn't burn cities, wage war, or bankrupt the nation. What he did was justify the unjust. He embodied a certain American archetype, the well-meaning bureaucrat who thinks that compromise is always virtuous, even when it shackles the innocent and sanctifies the guilty. He believed the union must survive, but never asked what kind of union was worth preserving. And when given the chance to confront the moral question of his era, he blinked. But if we have to be generous, Millard Fillmore modernized the White House. He installed its first library. He opened trade relations with Japan through Commodore Perry's expedition, an early step into the global age, and he truly feared disunion. He didn't want war. He thought, mistakenly, that preserving the status quo was peace. It wasn't. It was a pause button on a bomb. Sometimes the most dangerous presidents aren't the ones who swing the sword. They're the ones who polish the scabbard while others draw it. But what happens when the next president steps in, armed with charm, whiskey, and a cabinet of thieves? Warren G. Harding, the president who trusted the wrong people. Warren G. Harding never set out to be one of the worst presidents in American history. He wasn't a power-hungry tyrant. He didn't wage a disastrous war or plunge the country into depression. He wasn't evil. He wasn't even particularly ambitious. He just wasn't paying attention, and that, when you're sitting behind the world's most powerful desk, is sometimes worse. This is the story of a man who sleepwalked into office, handed the government to his poker buddies, and left behind one of the greatest corruption sagas the country has ever seen. Let's set the stage. The accidental candidate. The year is 1920. World War I is over. Woodrow Wilson is sick, broken, and deeply unpopular. The American people want peace, simplicity, and someone who doesn't have a nervous breakdown on international stages. Enter Warren Gamaliel Harding, a newspaper publisher from Ohio, a sitting senator, and a man best known for his tan, his deep voice, and his astonishing ability to say absolutely nothing with perfect diction. Harding didn't win the nomination. He emerged from a smoke-filled room at the Republican convention, literally. The phrase was coined to describe how party bosses in a hotel suite decided, we need someone boring, someone safe, someone who won't rock the boat. Harding's campaign slogan, return to normalcy. He won in a landslide. And what followed was perhaps the most hands-off, cigar-smoking, golf-playing presidency since the invention of hands, cigars, and golf, the cabinet of cronies. Harding's great sin wasn't action. It was delegation. He filled his cabinet with a bizarre mix, a few talented statesmen and a whole lot of opportunistic backroom operators. They were known as the Ohio Gang, because most of them were his drinking buddies from back home. Picture a boardroom staffed by fraternity brothers who all flunked civics but aced liquor smuggling. And once they were in power, they started helping themselves. To government funds, to federal oil reserves, to backroom deals and illegal kickbacks. Harding either didn't know or didn't care enough to look. His response to these whispers of corruption: "I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies all right. But my damn friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor at nights." The most infamous of these scandals? Teapot Dome. It sounds like a British soap opera, but it was actually a massive bribery scheme involving federal oil reserves and about 100 barrels of unethical slime. Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, a man Harding personally appointed, leased government oil reserves in Wyoming and California to private companies without competitive bidding. In exchange, he received bribes, ranches, cattle, stacks of cash, and probably a monogrammed oil derrick. Fall became the first U.S. cabinet member to go to prison for crimes committed in office. And that was just the headliner. The Veterans Bureau under Charles Forbes was a cash cow for corruption. Forbes embezzled millions, sold off government supplies, and threw wild parties at taxpayers' expense. He eventually fled the country and was dragged back in handcuffs. Meanwhile, the Justice Department, under Attorney General Harry Daugherty, was a murky swamp of bootlegging deals, protection rackets, and disappearing evidence. Daugherty himself was never convicted, but his assistant committed suicide, and his name remains radioactive to this day. All of this happened on Harding's watch. And Harding? He was too busy presiding. The distracted gentleman. Harding loved card games. He drank heavily, during Prohibition, no less. He had affairs, including one with a woman 30 years younger that produced an illegitimate child he refused to acknowledge. His letters to her, by the way, were later published. They include such poetic presidential lines as, "Wouldn't you like to get sopping wet out on Superior? Not the lake." Yes, that's real. Harding didn't pretend to be a genius. He openly admitted he was in over his head, and in a weird way, you almost feel bad for him. He wasn't a monster, he was a passenger. A man who wanted to be liked, not feared. He didn't crave power, he craved approval. He didn't destroy the country, he just left the door unlocked and walked away while it was being robbed. The sudden exit. In 1923, Harding began a cross-country tour. He was exhausted, paranoid, starting to hear whispers of the corruption swirling around his name. Then in San Francisco, he collapsed. A heart attack, or maybe a stroke. The medical reports are fuzzy. He died in his hotel suite at 57. No official autopsy was done. Rumors swirled that his wife, who had grown sick of his philandering, might have poisoned him. There's no evidence of that, but the fact that it wasn't immediately ruled out tells you everything you need to know about Harding's presidency. He died before the full scale of the scandals exploded, before the trials, before the convictions, before the legacy-crushing headlines, which may have been the luckiest thing that ever happened to him, but we must be fair. Harding did some good. He advocated for civil rights, rare for his party at the time. He spoke out against lynching, though he failed to pass any laws to stop it. He supported a world court and pushed for naval disarmament after World War I. And in terms of the economy, things weren't awful. He supported business, lowered taxes, and helped America slide into the roaring 20s. But his true legacy isn't policy. It's this. He taught us what happens when the presidency's treated like a gentleman's club, when loyalty is valued more than competence, when power is handed off to friends instead of vetted leaders. And if Harding was the president who fell asleep at the wheel, what happens when the next guy steps in and the entire economy falls off a cliff? Hebert Hoover, the human face of the Great Depression. Hebert Hoover didn't cause the Great Depression, but he stood at the gates while it stormed the country, held the keys, and politely refused to unlock any emergency exits. This is the story of a man who came into office as one of the most respected technocrats in the world and left as a national punchline. A man so hated by the end of his presidency, people built entire shantytowns and, named them after him in spite. He wasn't a crook. He wasn't a tyrant. He was something worse. He was a true believer in markets, in voluntarism, in the mystical resilience of American bootstraps. And when reality came crashing down, he responded with lectures, optimism, and crushing inaction. The golden resume. Let's start with the credentials. Hebert Hoover was a self-made millionaire, a humanitarian, a global savior, literally. He organized food relief for millions of starving Europeans during World War I. He led disaster recovery efforts. He turned logistics into compassion. He was known as the Great Engineer. When he ran for president in 1928, he was treated like a messianic technocrat. His campaign promised not just prosperity, but permanent prosperity. His slogan, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage, which sounds quaint until you realize most Americans were about to have neither. He won in a landslide. And then, less than a year into his presidency, the country fell into a black hole. October 1929, the crash. The stock market collapsed. At first, it looked like a bad day, then a bad week, then an unstoppable avalanche. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. Factories shut down. Farms collapsed under falling prices and rising debt. People lost their life savings overnight. The air in the country changed. Optimism turned brittle. Fear became structural. And President Hoover, he told people to stay calm. It wasn't, but Hoover believed in the magic of self-regulation. He believed that markets correct themselves, that panic is worse than pain, that government aid would turn proud Americans into dependents. So, while the country crumbled, Hoover urged businesses to voluntarily keep wages high, urged local charities to take care of the poor, urged states to figure things out. He created committees, commissions, conferences, and America kept sinking. The limits of compassion. To be clear, Hoover wasn't heartless. He truly wanted people to survive. He just thought the best way to help them was not to help too much. It's like watching a man trapped in a flood being offered a life raft and insisting, "No thanks, the water will recede soon. Let's all wait this out together." Hoover tried to rally the private sector. He pushed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loaned money to banks and railroads, hoping prosperity would trickle down. But the people at the bottom of the economic pyramid didn't need a trickle. They needed a flood of relief. Instead, they got slogans. He opposed direct aid to individuals, fearing it would create a dole culture. He refused to expand federal welfare programs. Instead, he supported local relief efforts that were already bankrupt. His philosophy, rugged individualism, was no match for mass destitution. The Bonus Army disaster. Then came the Bonus Army. In 1932, thousands of World War I veterans marched on Washington, demanding early payment of bonuses promised to them for their service. They were broke, hungry, desperate. They built a camp on the Anacostia Flats just outside D.C., a peaceful protest, a tent city of soldiers and their families. Hoover saw a mob. He sent in the U.S. Army. General Douglas MacArthur rolled tanks into the streets. Soldiers fixed bayonets. They burned the camp to the ground. 2 veterans were killed. An 11-week-old baby died from tear gas inhalation. A woman miscarried. The Capitol looked like a war zone. America was horrified. Hoover's approval rating, which was already on life support, flatlined. The footage of soldiers attacking veterans didn't just tarnish his presidency, it calcified him as the president who fought the wrong war against his own people. The fall from grace. By the time the 1932 election rolled around, Hoover was radioactive. His opponent, a charming, confident governor from New York named Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal and didn't think starving people should wait for market corrections. The results were brutal. Hoover lost in a landslide, but his humiliation didn't end there. On Inauguration Day, as Roosevelt prepared to take the oath, Hoover refused to smile, refused to speak on the ride over, refused to play nice. He wasn't just beaten, he was bitter. The legacy of the ghost president. So what do we do with Hebert Hoover? He was brilliant, earnest, ethical, and he failed in every way that mattered. Because leadership isn't just about being right in theory. It's about responding to reality. And Hoover couldn't adjust. He couldn't abandon his faith in the free market, even as it devoured the people it claimed to serve. He didn't believe in cruelty. He just believed in invisible hands while people were visibly starving. And history never forgave him. Shantytowns filled with the homeless were called Hoovervilles. Newspapers used as blankets were called Hoover blankets. Empty pockets turned inside out, Hoover flags. He became a national metaphor for a government that refused to see its own people. But let's be fair, after his presidency, Hoover redeemed himself in small, quiet ways. During World War II, he advised Roosevelt on famine relief. He helped design global food programs. He led commissions under Truman. He returned to his roots as a humanitarian. and helped feed millions again. It didn't erase the damage, but it added nuance, tragedy with a second act. Sometimes the worst presidencies aren't defined by malice or greed. They're defined by belief, unyielding, immovable belief in ideas that can't hold under human weight. But what if the next president didn't have any beliefs at all? Just boots, a saber, and a short temper. Zachary Taylor, the general who died before the fire reached the fuse. Zachary Taylor didn't want to be president. He was a general, a battlefield legend, a man of few words and fewer ideas about governing. He'd spent 40 years in the military, most of them outdoors, shouting at young men to reload faster. He hated politicians, thought parties were corrupt, didn't vote, didn't read much, didn't particularly like Washington, D.C. So naturally, in 1848, America elected him president. This is a story about a man dragged into the halls of power by the myth of heroism and dropped dead before he could figure out which way the moral compass pointed. And like all great American tragedies, it involves war, slavery, political standoffs, and possibly rotten fruit. The reluctant candidate. Zachary Taylor's legend was forged in blood. He earned national fame as a general during the Mexican-American War, where his victories at Palo Alto, Monterrey, and Buena Vista made him a household name. Old Rough and Ready, they called him, because he wore muddy boots, slept in tents, and rode straight into cannon fire like it owed him money. He was everything a war-weary, manifest, destiny-drunk public wanted in 1848. Strong, decisive, vaguely apolitical, a blank slate with medals. The Whigs, desperate for someone who wasn't a political ideologue, nominated him even though he had never held public office and barely understood what the party stood for. Taylor agreed, somewhat confusedly, and ran what might be the most passive campaign in American history. He didn't give speeches, he didn't campaign, he barely even wrote letters, but he won anyway. Because America loves a man in uniform, especially when they don't know what he believes. President Taylor, war hero meets bureaucracy. When he got to the White House, things got awkward. Taylor wasn't a statesman. He was a commander. He hated political maneuvering, ignored party strategy, and preferred to run the presidency like a military outpost. He took meetings in muddy boots. He didn't know half his cabinet's names. He once described the presidency as a trust I never sought, which sounds noble until you remember he still accepted it. And then came the storm. Slavery. Specifically, the question of whether new territories gained from Mexico should allow it. Taylor owned slaves himself. He was a Southern plantation man, but to everyone's surprise, he opposed expanding slavery into the new territories, not out of moral outrage, mind you, but because he thought it would destabilize the Union. He didn't want more slave states, he didn't want secession, he didn't want a war on his watch. So he stood firm. He wanted California and New Mexico admitted as free states, without the usual compromise packages and legislative games. This infuriated the South. Southern politicians, led by senators like John C. Calhoun, threatened secession. They painted Taylor as a traitor to his class, a military man too drunk on unionism to defend their way of life. And Taylor? He gave them a warning. If necessary for the preservation of the Union, I will lead the army myself and hang any man taken in rebellion against the United States. That's not a metaphor. That was Zachary Taylor's actual plan. If the South seceded, he would ride down with troops and hang them personally. It was maybe the first time in American history a sitting president openly threatened to execute half of Congress. And for a moment, it looked like he might mean it. But then, in July 1850, barely 16 months into his presidency, Taylor attended a 4th of July celebration at the Washington Monument. It was sweltering. He wore full military dress. He ate a bowl of raw cherries, washed it down with iced milk. Later that night, he got violently ill, vomiting, diarrhea, fever. 5 days later, he was dead, a death with questions. The official cause was acute gastroenteritis, likely a mix of food poisoning and heat stroke. But ever since, rumors have swirled. Was he poisoned? After all, he'd made powerful enemies, slaveholders who saw him as a turncoat, legislators who feared he would crush secession with the military. A president threatening war against his own region wasn't exactly popular. In the 1990s, researchers even exhumed his body and tested for arsenic. The results? Inconclusive. Not enough poison to kill. Probably just bad cherries, or dysentery, or the fact that 19th century medicine was basically try whiskey or die. Either way, Zachary Taylor's sudden death changed the course of history because the man who replaced him was Millard Fillmore, and unlike Taylor, Fillmore supported the Compromise of 1850, including the Fugitive Slave Act. Taylor, for all his flaws, would likely have vetoed it. So, yes, a bowl of fruit may have helped usher in the bloodiest decade in American history, the moral puzzle of Zachary Taylor. So what are we left with? A man who fought in 4 wars, killed on behalf of expansionism, and owned dozens of human beings, and also a president who stood firm against the spread of slavery, threatened to hang traitors, and died before he could carry out either his worst or best intentions. Taylor wasn't a moral reformer. He didn't fight slavery because it was evil. He fought it because it threatened the Union. His motivations were pragmatic. Not pure, but sometimes motives don't matter. Actions do. And in his own bullheaded, gruff, military way, Zachary Taylor might have actually held the line had he lived. Instead, he became a transitional figure, a broken bridge between war and compromise, a man who could have sparked civil war 10 years early, or maybe prevented it entirely. History will never know, but let's be fair, Taylor never enriched himself, never lied to the public, never cowered before power. He took a stand, one that cost him dearly, and never backed down. He died before corruption could find him, before cowardice could tempt him, before the office had time to reshape him. And maybe in some grim, poetic way, that's the only kind of integrity the presidency allows. But if Taylor was the soldier who refused to yield, what happens when the next president doesn't even know which side to pick? Martin Van Buren, the little magician who pulled a depression out of his hat. Martin Van Buren was a builder. He built coalitions. He built political machines. He built the very idea of a modern American political party. And then he built a stage so large, so sophisticated, so delicate, that when the economy collapsed, it crushed him like a puppet beneath his own strings. This is the story of a man who started at the bottom, rose to the top, and discovered that being a political genius doesn't help when people can't afford bread. Van Buren wasn't corrupt. He wasn't cruel. He was smart. Too smart, maybe. The kind of man who could read a room, play both sides, and walk out smiling until the room started burning. The rise of the magician. Martin Van Buren was born in a tavern in Kinderhook, New York, and he never forgot how to read people from across a crowded room. He started as a lawyer, became a senator, and eventually built the Albany Regency, a political machine that made him the architect of democratic dominance. He was slick, polished, bilingual. He spoke Dutch, charming in that wily uncle who knows where the bodies are buried way. Van Buren believed deeply in the power of organization. Not grand speeches, not philosophical treatises, but voter rolls, newspapers, favors, machines. He was the founding father of the Democratic Party, helping mold it under Andrew Jackson into a populist powerhouse of white male suffrage, states' rights, and limited federal government. In return, Jackson made him vice president. Then in 1836, Van Buren ran for president himself and won. He inherited the presidency from the most charismatic strongman in American history. And what he got with it was a financial time bomb. The Panic of 1837, boom, bust, blame. You know those slow-motion train wrecks that everyone sees coming, but nobody stops? That was the economy in 1836. Jackson, Van Buren's mentor, had just dismantled the Second Bank of the United States, flooded the economy with unstable currency, and issued a clumsy executive order, specie circular, requiring land purchases to be made with gold or silver, not paper notes. Combine that with global credit tightening, reckless speculation, and some spicy wheat crop failures, and you've got a financial Molotov cocktail. Van Buren took office in March 1837. By May, the panic had begun. Banks collapsed, credit froze, businesses failed, prices dropped like corpses, unemployment soared, farmers were ruined, merchants were ruined. The working class was obliterated, It was the first great financial depression in American history, and Van Buren walked into it with the enthusiasm of a man who thought he was arriving at a dinner party and found a funeral, a crisis of philosophy. Now here's the twist. Van Buren understood what was happening. He wasn't clueless. He saw the collapse as the natural result of reckless speculation, easy credit, and bad policy. But he also refused to intervene. Why? Because Van Buren was a Jeffersonian minimalist. He believed the federal government had no constitutional role in propping up the economy, that the downturn, while painful, would correct itself. He believed the cure would be worse than the disease. So he stood back, offered no direct relief, no bailouts, no jobs programs, no currency intervention. He watched the country bleed and handed it a towel. To many Americans, it felt like betrayal. The man who'd promised continuity with Jackson turned out to be more hands-off than a ghost. The divorce bill. Too little, too weird. Van Buren's one major economic solution was a policy known as the independent treasury system. The idea? Remove federal funds from private banks and keep them in government-controlled vaults. It was a move to decouple the government from the instability of the private sector, a kind of 19th century firewall. The public called it the divorce bill. And like most divorces, it came too late, solved little, and left everyone bitter. It passed in 1840, just before Van Buren was about to get voted out of office. By then, public patience had evaporated like a puddle on hot cobblestones. The Fall, Tippecanoe, and Misery, too. In 1840, the Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison, a barely articulate war hero whose main platform was, "I'm not Martin Van Buren." The campaign was brutal. The Whigs painted Van Buren as an out-of-touch aristocrat, despite his tavern boy roots, sipping wine from fancy goblets while Americans starved. His nickname? Martin Van Ruin. Catchy, damning, fatal. Harrison stomped him in the election. And just like that, the man who'd built the Democratic Party found himself on the outside of power, watching his own creation fracture. The return no one asked for, but Van Buren wasn't done. In 1848, he ran for president again, this time under the banner of the Free Soil Party, an anti-slavery movement dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery into new territories. This shocked everyone. Van Buren had spent decades tiptoeing around the slavery issue, carefully balancing the pro- and anti-slavery factions of his party. And now he was all in on stopping it? Yes, but don't mistake it for a late-life moral epiphany. It was mostly political revenge. Van Buren was furious that the Democrats had passed him over in 1844 for James K. Polk. The Free Soil candidacy was his way of siphoning votes, humiliating the Democrats, and rewriting his legacy. He didn't win. He didn't even come close. But he helped the Whigs win by splitting the Democratic vote and paving the way for Zachary Taylor. Van Buren, the party loyalist, had become the party's saboteur, and then he vanished into the quiet margins of history. The contradiction of Martin Van Buren. He was a brilliant tactician, a master of party building, a smooth operator in a system he helped design. But when the country needed compassion, he gave them doctrine. When they needed action, he gave them orthodoxy. And when he had a second chance to make a moral stand, it was rooted more in spite than clarity. He was a man who understood the rules of politics better than almost anyone, and still watched them collapse under the weight of human desperation. But to be fair, Van Buren helped shape the democratic system we still use today. He believed in peaceful transfers of power. He rejected populist violence. He fought corruption with structure and chaos with organization. And his late-life stance against slavery expansion, whether sincere or not, did put him on the right side of history, eventually. But if Van Buren was the architect of the party system, the next guy proved that a well-designed machine can still short-circuit. Rutherford B. Hayes, the president who ended Reconstruction in a whisper. Rutherford Burchard Hayes didn't come to destroy Reconstruction. He came to end the drama, to tidy things up, to calm the national nerves after a disputed election that almost cracked the system. And to do it, he made a deal, a quiet deal, a private deal, a compromise that ended federal protection for millions of Black Americans and ushered in nearly a century of segregation, terror, and political erasure. This is the story of the 19th President of the United States, a man who won by the skin of a loophole, and who governed with the silence of a man who knows he's already made the biggest decision of his life before even taking the oath. The most corrupt election in American history, probably. Let's rewind to 1876. America is tired. The Civil War is over, but Reconstruction is dragging on like a ghost that refuses to leave the room. Federal troops occupy the South. Southern Democrats want their autonomy back. Ruda, they want to run things without black voters or Northern oversight. The North is growing restless, and the economy isn't helping. Enter Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican governor of Ohio, Civil War general, mild-mannered reformer, and human chamomile tea. Running against him, Samuel J. Tilden, Democratic governor of New York, a party boss with a reformist streak and actual charisma. Tilden won the popular vote convincingly. He had more than 250,000 votes over Hayes, but the electoral vote, that's where the bloodletting started. 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, submitted 2 sets of electoral results each. One for Hayes, one for Tilden. Chaos, accusations, fraud on both sides. Dead men were recorded as voting. Ballot boxes vanished. Governors fought their own legislatures. Riots loomed. A special electoral commission was formed. 15 members, 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and in one of the most predictably partisan decisions in American history, they gave all the disputed votes to Hayes, putting him at exactly 185, the exact number needed to win. Democrats were ready to fight. They called it the stolen election. Republicans called it orderly resolution. History would call it the Compromise of 1877, the compromise that ended Reconstruction. To secure the presidency and avoid outright civil war, Hayes's people made a backroom deal with Southern Democrats. The terms, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, Reconstruction would end. The South could govern itself again. In exchange, the Democrats would accept Hayes as president and stop contesting the result. It was, in essence, a trade, the White House for black rights, and Hayes took the deal. In April 1877, just weeks into his presidency, federal troops left the southern capitals they had protected since the war. With their departure, Reconstruction officially ended, and with it, so did the only serious attempt at multiracial democracy in the South for the next 90 years. What followed? A political pogrom. The withdrawal of troops meant more than just fewer boots on the ground. It meant no more federal oversight of elections, no more enforcement of civil rights, no more protection for newly enfranchised black citizens. White supremacist governments, thinly veiled as redeemers, returned to power across the South. Jim Crow laws were passed. Black voters were intimidated, beaten, and purged from rolls. Lynchings rose. Segregation became law. Hayes had promised local self-government. What he enabled was systemic apartheid, and he knew it. The Hayes presidency, reform with regret. Hayes didn't walk into the White House as a villain. He genuinely believed in meritocracy, civil service reform, and moderate governance. He fought against the spoil system, tried to root out patronage, clashed with his own party bosses over corruption. He believed in education for black Americans. He visited Southern schools. He gave speeches about equality, but it was all moral window dressing. Because without federal power, without legal enforcement, none of it mattered. It was like giving a man a book while others set his house on fire. Hayes thought the South could be coaxed into justice, that removing the federal presence would lead to reconciliation. Instead, it led to re-enslavement by another name, the problem with peace. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hayes didn't want a second civil war. He saw a divided country on the edge of chaos. He made a choice, peace over justice, and peace was delivered. But justice, that was delayed for generations. Hayes never ran for re-election. He saw himself as a transitional figure, a stabilizer, the human equivalent of hitting the pause button. And in the North, he succeeded. But in the South, his presidency was a funeral. But to be fair, Hayes did believe in reform. He was the first president to seriously fight for civil service reform, replacing political patronage with merit-based hiring. It laid the groundwork for future reforms. He rebuilt public trust in the presidency after the scandal-ridden Grant years, and unlike many before and after him, he left office with his integrity intact. He didn't steal. He didn't lie. He didn't wage unnecessary wars. He just chose to look away when justice demanded confrontation. And if Hayes gave up Reconstruction to keep the peace, the next guy gave away prosperity to buy votes. Benjamin Harrison, the man who spent big, taxed bigger, and vanished faster. Benjamin Harrison is the kind of president who disappears in plain sight, sandwiched between Grover Cleveland, twice, and overshadowed by the Gilded Age's louder villains. Harrison is rarely remembered, but he probably should be, because in 4 short years, he presided over one of the most aggressive bursts of federal spending in American history. He passed controversial laws, ballooned the budget, ticked off voters, and helped ignite the economic panic that consumed the next administration. He didn't scream, he didn't swagger. He governed with a scholar's pen, a preacher's tone, and the fiscal restraint of a man who thought money grows on tariffs. And in the end, he was punished not for corruption, not for scandal, but for doing too much, with too little awareness of how angry it would make people. A gilded resume, a quiet candidate. Harrison was born into politics. He was the grandson of William Henry Harrison. Yes, the gave a 2-hour speech, died in a month guy. Political royalty, if dying early makes you noble. Ben Harrison was a Civil War general, a devout Presbyterian, and a lawyer known for being icy, intelligent, and immune to small talk. In 1888, he was chosen as the Republican nominee to run against Grover Cleveland, the incumbent Democrat. Harrison lost the popular vote by over 90,000 ballots, but thanks to the Electoral College, he carried enough states to win. Sound familiar? He entered the White House not with a roar, but with the tense hum of a machine about to overheat. The $1 billion Congress. The big headline from Harrison's presidency? Federal spending exploded. Under his administration, the U.S. budget exceeded $1 billion for the first time. That number may sound quaint today, but at the time it was scandalous. His Republican-controlled Congress passed bill after bill: veterans' pensions, naval expansion, infrastructure investments, subsidies. It was the fiscal version of a shopping spree with someone else's credit card. The public response? Not gratitude, rage. Working-class voters saw their taxes go up, prices rise, and wages stagnate. Newspapers dubbed it the $1 billion Congress as a punchline, not a compliment. Even fellow Republicans started squirming, and the cause of much of this mess: tariffs. The McKinley Tariff, an economic time bomb. Let's talk about the McKinley Tariff of 1890, a law passed under Harrison's watch that jacked up tariffs to an average of 48%, one of the highest rates in U.S. history. The idea was classic protectionism: shield American industries from foreign competition, boost domestic production, help workers. In practice, it backfired hard. Prices for everyday goods shot up. International trade suffered. Exporters lost markets. Farmers, in particular, were crushed. Even Americans who had once supported protectionism began to feel like they were paying the price of patriotism. Literally, the McKinley Tariff was supposed to protect jobs. Instead, it protected monopolies and hurt consumers. It was like duct taping a leaky dam and watching the water rise anyway. Harrison defended it proudly. And the voters? They took notes. The Sherman-Silver mistake. As if one economic controversy wasn't enough, Harrison also signed the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, a law requiring the government to buy millions of ounces of silver and issue treasury notes against it. The goal? Appease Western miners and farmers who wanted inflation to raise crop prices and ease debt burdens. But coupling silver with gold undermined confidence in U.S. currency. Bankers panicked. Foreign investors grew nervous. It didn't crash the economy immediately, but it planted the seeds of the Panic of 1893. The bill was supposed to unite constituencies. Instead, it confused the market and divided the country into gold versus silver factions, a currency Cold War that would dominate the next decade. Harrison again thought he was fixing things. He was actually loading a shotgun, handing it to the next president, and hoping no one pulled the trigger. Civil rights. An almost heroic failure. And here's where it gets emotionally complicated. Because amid all the economic blundering, Benjamin Harrison did try to protect civil rights. He pushed for federal education funding and federal oversight of Southern elections. In an era when black voters were being systematically purged, terrorized, and lynched. He called out Southern states for voter suppression. He wanted Congress to pass legislation ensuring black Americans could actually participate in democracy. But the bills failed. Southern Democrats filibustered. Northern Republicans got cold feet. Harrison gave up the fight. He tried. Then he stopped. The cause of justice turned into a missed opportunity. Another chapter in America's long tradition of half-hearted racial progress. The election of 1892, the cost of ambition. By 1892, the political winds had shifted hard. The Populist Party emerged, an angry coalition of farmers and laborers furious about tariffs. The Gold Standard and the Washington elite, Democrats, sensing weakness, nominated Grover Cleveland for a second time. And he won. Cleveland reclaimed the presidency from Harrison, making him the only U.S. president to serve non-consecutive terms. The public message was clear. You raised our taxes. You spiked our prices. You ignored the signs. Now pack your things. The forgotten one-termer, Benjamin Harrison, returned to Indiana, resumed his law practice, and quietly receded from public life. His wife Caroline died in 1892. In a move that scandalized polite society, he later married her much younger niece. He lived long enough to see the economy implode in 1893, a final cosmic joke delivered by the system he helped destabilize. History didn't demonize him. It just forgot him. And in some ways, that's worse. Because Harrison was a man who meant well, worked hard, and passed big laws, but lacked the political instinct to know what people actually wanted, or needed, or could afford. But to be fair, he modernized the Navy. He expanded the Forest Reserve. He supported antitrust legislation with the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law that would later be used to break up monopolies and set the stage for the progressive era. And his efforts on civil rights, while failed, were genuine. He believed the Constitution applied to everyone. He just didn't fight hard enough to prove it. But if Harrison's overreach planted the seeds of panic, the next guy would harvest the shame. Richard Nixon, the genius who taped his own demise. Richard Nixon wanted to be great. He wanted to be Lincoln, Roosevelt, Washington even. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, the president who won by a landslide and left in disgrace, the only one so far to resign. And the best part? He did it to himself. This is the story of Richard Nixon, the man who created the modern imperial presidency, made real diplomatic history, and then covered up a third-rate burglary so sloppily, so arrogantly, so fatally, that he buried his own administration beneath the weight of lies and magnetic tape. The comeback kid from the dead. Nixon's political career was already supposed to be over. He'd been vice president under Eisenhower, lost the presidency to John F. Kennedy in 1960, and then lost again, spectacularly, when he ran for governor of California in 1962. After that loss, he gave the press a bitter farewell. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Spoiler, we would. In 1968, Nixon rose from the political grave, rebranded as the law and order candidate, the cold, calculating alternative to the chaos of the 1960s. Assassinations, Vietnam, riots. Nixon positioned himself as the last adult in the room. And he won. Then, in 1972, he won again. By a margin so big it bordered on monarchy, 49 states. Only Massachusetts and D.C. said no. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it was the beginning of a historic, televised unraveling. Paranoia in the West Wing. Nixon's administration was never just about policy. It was about control. He created an internal unit called the Plumbers, originally tasked with stopping government leaks, but they soon evolved into a quasi-secret police, wiretapping journalists, sabotaging political enemies, even burglarizing psychiatrists' offices. Why? Because Nixon saw enemies everywhere. To him, journalists were traitors. Protesters were anarchists. Democrats were a fifth column. The country was under siege, and he was the last line of defense. He recorded everything, literally. He had tape recorders installed in the Oval Office, capturing every meeting, every conversation. The man who feared leaks created the most leakable archive of all time. And then came Watergate, the burglary that broke a president. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee, headquarters at the Watergate complex. They were connected to Nixon's re-election committee. They carried wiretaps, cameras, and enough spy gear to stage a community theater version of Mission Impossible. At first, it seemed like a minor scandal. Nixon denied any involvement, called the accusations political theater. The press mostly moved on, but two Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, kept digging, and what they found was the tip of a bureaucratic iceberg. Bribes, cover-ups, FBI interference, money laundering, political sabotage. It wasn't the crime that destroyed Nixon. It was the cover-up. The tapes come back to haunt him. As the scandal grew, Congress began investigating. Special prosecutors were appointed. Witnesses testified under oath. Then someone dropped a bombshell. The tapes existed. All of them. The Senate demanded them. Nixon refused. Said it violated executive privilege. Cue a constitutional crisis. In 1973, Nixon ordered the firing of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. The Attorney General refused and resigned. The Deputy Attorney General also refused and resigned. Only the third-in-line Solicitor General Robert Bork followed the order. This chain of events became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. America lost its mind. Protests erupted. Congress talked impeachment. Public trust in Nixon collapsed like a casino in an earthquake. And still, Nixon clung to power until July 1974, when the Supreme Court ordered him to release the tapes. And there, in his own voice, was the proof. The plotting, the cover-up, the contempt for the law, a president caught red-handed in his own surveillance state. The final blow was the smoking gun tape, recorded just days after the Watergate break-in, where Nixon discussed using the CIA to shut down the FBI's investigation. Game over. August 9th, 1974, Resignation Day. That morning, Nixon became the first U.S. president to resign. He flew away from the White House on Marine One while the country watched. Stunned, exhausted, vaguely ashamed. He left behind a constitutional wound that still hasn't fully healed. The irony of Nixon. Here's the maddening part. Richard Nixon wasn't a do-nothing president. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't corrupt in the traditional, where's the money sense. He was wildly effective in all the ways that make his fall feel Shakespearean. He opened relations with China, a masterstroke of Cold War diplomacy. He signed the Environmental Protection Agency into existence. He passed the Clean Air Act, Title IX, and affirmative action mandates. He negotiated the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with the Soviets. He even ended the military draft. He did all of that, then destroyed himself because of a burglary he didn't need. He was already winning, already ahead, already secure, but he couldn't stop watching, couldn't stop fearing, couldn't stop controlling. When the president does it, that means it is not illegal. He said that after leaving office, because even in exile, Nixon believed in Nixon. But, to be fair, Nixon did what no one else dared. He went to China, shifted the Cold War, and imagined a multipolar future before anyone else had the nerve. He navigated a country fractured by war, protest, and paranoia, and he had moments, brief, brilliant flashes, where he governed like a statesman. But those moments were buried under the rubble of his own ego. Sometimes the greatest threat to the presidency is the president himself. But if Nixon's fall was loud, televised, and epic, the next president's failures were quieter, politer, and beige enough to almost forget. Chester A. Arthur, the machine politician who accidentally grew a conscience. Chester A. Arthur was not supposed to be a good president. He was not supposed to be president at all. He was, at best, a reward, a political cocktail napkin scribbled with a promise. The loyal lapdog of New York's most powerful patronage machine. Tammany Hall with better manners. A vice presidential pick meant to balance a ticket, not lead a nation. And then in 1881, a bullet changed everything. This is the story of Chester Alan Arthur. Party stooge turned accidental reformer, fashion icon turned reluctant executive, and the only U.S. president to be genuinely shocked by his own moral awakening. Before the presidency, the swamp personified. Let's rewind. Before he was sworn in under the weight of national trauma, Chester Arthur was what historians politely call a political operative. He was a collector of favors, a handler of votes. He worked for Roscoe Conkling, the senator from New York, who ran the state's stalwart Republican machine like a mafia godfather. Arthur's job? Appoint loyalists to customs positions at the New York Port Authority, an office so lucrative and corrupt it basically printed money. Arthur was known as the collector of the port, a role more powerful than most governorships. His reputation? Fancy suits, luxurious sideburns, and zero inclination toward reform. He made $50,000 a year when the president made $25,000 and spent it on wine, furniture, and a staff of valets who rotated his shoes. When reformers accused him of corruption, he laughed. When President Rutherford B. Hayes fired him, he sulked, but didn't change. Then came 1880. The Republican Party was divided between reformers, the half-breeds, and the machine politicians, the stalwarts. The compromise candidate for president, James A. Garfield. To balance the ticket, they picked Chester Arthur as vice president. Why? Because he was loyal, and everyone thought harmless. The Garfield assassination, the accidental promotion. In July 1881, 4 months into his term, President James Garfield was shot by a disgruntled office seeker, Charles Guiteau, who screamed, "I am a stalwart. Arthur is president now." It was not the endorsement Arthur wanted. For weeks, as Garfield lay dying, Arthur was terrified. He knew the country suspected him. The shooter had literally invoked Arthur's name. Reformers were furious. Rumors swirled that Arthur would pardon Guiteau. Newspapers called him an accessory to political murder. When Garfield finally died, Arthur took the oath in private, alone, an afterthought. His rise to the presidency was soaked in guilt and steeped in suspicion, and what followed stunned everyone. The moral pivot. Something changed. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was legacy anxiety, maybe it was the quiet horror of having power he never asked for. But Chester A. Arthur, the machine man, the patronage prince, became a reformer. He broke ties with Roscoe Conkling. He refused to stack his administration with loyalists. He started showing signs of independence, alienating the very men who had once owned him like a custom waistcoat. Then came the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. This law created a merit-based system for federal jobs. It established the Civil Service Commission. It ended the spoil system, at least on paper. Reformers were stunned. Stalwarts were enraged. The New York machine never forgave him. And Arthur, he signed it with a quiet, reflective calm. No fanfare, no speeches, just a pen in a gloved hand, scribbling his way into one of the most unexpected U-turns in American politics. If it were not for the reporters, I would tell you the truth. He knew what people thought of him, and he didn't bother to argue. The silent president. Arthur's term was one of the quietest in presidential history. He didn't seek re-election. He didn't campaign. He vetoed pork barrel bills. He modernized the Navy. He renovated the White House. He also did almost nothing about the South's repressive laws or the rising wave of voter suppression. He didn't touch civil rights. He didn't fight Jim Crow. He didn't try to expand protections. In his silence, justice stalled. Like so many before and after him, he looked at racial injustice and blinked. But he did not enrich himself. He did not lie. And, perhaps most shockingly, he governed with a humility that bordered on penitence. He was diagnosed with Bright's disease, a kidney failure condition, while still in office. He kept it secret, knew he was dying, knew he wouldn't run again, knew in his bones that his presidency was borrowed time. And maybe that's why he tried, quietly, elegantly, with less ego and more introspection than any president since Lincoln. The exit nobody noticed. Chester Arthur left office in 1885. He did not write memoirs. He did not lobby for influence. He simply disappeared. He died the following year. Few mourned him publicly. No monuments, no great send-off. He left behind a record that confused everyone. A corrupt operator who reformed government, a party loyalist who betrayed the machine, a dandy who faced death in silence, a ghost who wore velvet. But, to be fair, Arthur didn't stop all corruption. He didn't push for civil rights. He didn't tackle inequality. But he defied expectations. He changed. He didn't die the man he was. And in a job that usually reveals the worst in people, Chester A. Arthur evolved, which is more than we can say for most. But if Arthur was a surprise reformer, the next man on the list is no surprise at all. George W. Bush, the decider who chose poorly. George Walker. Bush never meant to be a wartime president. He came into office talking about tax cuts, faith-based initiatives, and restoring dignity to the White House after the Clinton era's very public zipper malfunction. He was affable, folksy, prone to malapropisms and mispronunciations that made late-night hosts weep with gratitude. But then came the September event, and what followed wasn't just a presidency. It was a redefinition of American power, a chain reaction of wars, surveillance, economic collapse, and unresolved grief that reshaped the 21st century. This is the story of the decider, the man who started 2 wars, oversaw torture, watched the financial system collapse, and somehow still ended up painting flowers in his retirement like Bob Ross on Xanax. The campaign nobody took seriously. In 2000, Bush ran against Vice President Al Gore in an election that felt, at the time, like low stakes. Bush campaigned as a compassionate conservative, a guy you could have a beer with, a man of faith, oil, and extremely low expectations. He lost the popular vote, but thanks to a little chaos in Florida and a 5-4 Supreme Court decision, he won the Electoral College. The country was split, suspicious, already tense, and then everything changed. The September event. In 2001, 4 hijacked planes changed the course of history, and a president suddenly transformed from part-time cowboy into full-time wartime leader. Bush's approval ratings soared. The country rallied, the world offered support, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like unity. Then the decision started, and things began to spiral. The war on terror. Everywhere, forever. First came Afghanistan. The Taliban had harbored al-Qaeda. Bush demanded justice. The U.S. invaded, toppled the regime, and began the longest war in American history. Then came Iraq. Bush, guided by Vice President Dick Cheney, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and a cocktail of neoconservative dreams, claimed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He didn't, but the U.S. invaded anyway in 2003. Baghdad fell. Statues toppled. Bush declared mission accomplished. It wasn't. Iraq descended into chaos, insurgency, sectarian violence, thousands of American troops killed, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians dead, a power vacuum that eventually gave rise to ISIS. The justifications shifted. UMD's democracy, terror links, but the body count kept climbing, and Bush kept smiling. Torture, surveillance, and the Patriot Act. In the name of security, Bush's administration authorized what it called enhanced interrogation techniques, translation, torture, waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, CIA black sites across the globe. It was secret, then leaked, then justified. The moral line blurred, then disappeared. At home, the Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers, wiretaps, library records, secret courts. America became safer and less free. But Bush wasn't losing sleep. He believed in the decider, his name for himself. He would make the call. Morality was secondary to resolve. The response to Hurricane Katrina, a failure on American soil. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. The levees failed. Entire neighborhoods flooded. Citizens were stranded in stadiums for days. Bodies floated through the streets. The world watched in horror. Bush flew over the damage in Air Force One. Didn't land, didn't touch down, didn't seem to grasp the scale of the crisis. Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. G.W. Bush, to FEMA head Michael Brown. Brown resigned, trust eroded. For many Americans, especially Black Americans, Katrina was the moment the mask slipped. The moment it became clear the federal government wasn't coming. The Great Recession, the final blow. Then came 2008. The housing bubble burst. Major banks began to fail. The stock market collapsed. Unemployment surged. The Bush administration's lax regulatory philosophy had helped fuel the crisis. Subprime mortgages, derivatives, unchecked Wall Street risk. When it all came crashing down, Bush authorized the TARP bailout, a $700 billion rescue package for the same financial institutions that caused the crash. It may have prevented total collapse, but to the average American, it felt like this. The rich got saved. The poor got foreclosed. Bush left office in 2009 with some of the lowest approval ratings in modern history. He handed the presidency to Barack Obama, handed over 2 wars, a wrecked economy, a bitter, polarized nation, and a legacy that felt, at best, like collateral damage. But here's the weird part. History started softening on him. Years later, when Trump arrived, some Americans looked back on Bush as the good old days, a man who, while destructive, at least believed in institutions, who, despite the carnage, loved democracy, not just applause. Bush retreated, started painting portraits of wounded soldiers, foreign leaders, his own dog. He smiled more, talked less. He became a paradox, a man who launched 2 wars and wrote a book about empathy. But to be fair, Bush led the country through an unimaginable tragedy. He didn't exploit the September event to suspend elections. He didn't become a dictator. He didn't cling to power. He believed in democracy, even as he distorted it. He made decisions, wrong ones, yes, but he owned them. Even when the world begged for an apology, Bush refused to grovel. I'm the decider and I decide what is best. George Walker Bush. And maybe that's what makes him so hard to reckon with. He believed. He meant well. He caused unspeakable damage. And now he paints. These weren't just bad presidents. They were men caught in the gears of history. Sometimes breaking them, sometimes getting broken. They weren't all evil, but they all left damage behind. And in their failures, we see something else. The terrifying fragility of democracy, the way it bends, buckles, sometimes breaks, not through coups or tyrants, but through compromise, cowardice, paperwork, and polite applause. These were the men who failed not just the office, but the moment. They teach us that intelligence isn't enough, charisma isn't enough, belief isn't enough. Sometimes leadership is about restraint, other times about risk, always about timing. And when the timing's wrong, even a war hero or a man of peace or a soft-spoken lawyer from Ohio can bring a country to the edge of ruin. This has been the worst U.S. presidents. We'll leave the final judgment to history, but just in case, maybe don't put your faith in the smile. Watch the hands.